Going on, APUSH peeps? Video number 6 for you today. This is on the British colonies. You will absolutely see this in some way, shape, or form on tests this year. It screams to me an essay topic or short answer question. Just like the last video, if you're in my class, you're going to do a writing assignment on it. Let's do a shout out to Ms. Sexton's class in Italy. That is so cool that people in Italy are watching my videos. Thank you. I appreciate it. Best of luck this year. If you want a shout out, just leave it in the comments. Let me know it's for APUSH too. Let's start off talking about the Chesapeake and North Carolina. Now, this is going to be kind of the upper region of the southern colonies, and the Chesapeake is made up of two colonies. Very important to note, it is Maryland and Virginia. That's because of the Chesapeake Bay right here. They both sit on the Chesapeake Bay. These colonies practice predominantly agriculture and are characterized by rural settlements. Cash crops like tobacco was a major focus of these colonies. It's very arduous, labor-intensive work. And indentured servants made up most of the workforce prior to Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. Now, a little background info on Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon, seen here in the middle, led this uprising in Jamestown, Virginia, of a lot of landless whites who wanted to acquire land in Jamestown, but all the land was taken, and they wanted protection from the governor of Virginia against Native Americans on land located outside of Jamestown, and they did not get this protection, so they rebelled. So they're going to burn Jamestown. Like I did, I just set Jamestown on fire. That took a long time for me to do. Now, the headright system was established in the Chesapeake, and this benefited wealthy landowners. They would receive 50 acres of land for each indentured servant they paid the passage for. So think back to indentured servants. These were Europeans who came here and worked for a period of 4 to 7 years. If you were to hire an indentured servant, you would receive 50 acres of land, and a lot of that land would be used to grow crops like tobacco. Now, after 1676, after this rebellion of landless whites, plantation owners are going to switch to African slave labor. Now, demographics or the makeup of society in the Chesapeake and North Carolina, there were some families that were mostly white to male indentured servants in these regions, and there's a lower life expectancy than New England and the middle colonies. Some people lived as little as 20 years they would die. And in Maryland, there is a very famous act called the Maryland Acts of Toleration. This was created by Cecil Calvert, the proprietor of Maryland, to give protection to Catholics in particular. So what the Maryland Acts of Toleration did was grant religious toleration to all Christians. So any denomination of Christianity you could practice in Maryland, but this was specifically aimed to protect the Catholics against the growing number of Protestants that were settling in Maryland. Jumping on over to New England, we're going to the northern colonies. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire made up New England. They were initially settled by Puritans. These were individuals who wanted to purify the Anglican or the English church of its Catholic rituals, so they came to America to have religious freedom. Massachusetts Bay, one of the most influential people was John Winthrop, a governor several times over, and he gave a very famous speech called A City Upon a Hill. The idea that this would be this perfect ideal society for other societies to look up to. If you're following along with my enhanced video guides, you will actually see his speech there, and we'll dissect it in there. Massachusetts Bay was not religiously tolerant to other groups. They basically favored Puritans only, and this is seen through Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, two people who lived in Massachusetts Bay. They were banished because they challenged the church, and Roger Williams will go on to found the colony of Rhode Island. So he was kicked out of Massachusetts and then founded Rhode Island in New England. So let's talk about Rhode Island. This was founded by Roger Williams, and there is religious toleration, actually complete religious toleration. And just like Pennsylvania, which we'll talk about in a minute, they paid Native Americans for land. So if you were a person who either did not practice religion or practiced a different religion than the Puritans, you would not want to settle in Massachusetts. You would want to settle in Rhode Island, where there's complete religious toleration for all. Now, the makeup of New England colonies were often small towns, family farms, not plantations like the South. So these were family farms that were growing enough food to survive, subsistence farming. There was a mixed economy of agriculture and commerce, especially in cities like Boston and other port cities. There were also merchants and shipbuilding and whaling that helped with the economy. Whaling was very profitable if you were successful. And slavery did exist here, as it did in all the colonies. It just was on a smaller scale in the north. So the demographics of New England, you're more likely to see extended families than other regions. That includes grandparents. First look, doesn't this look like she's playing with an iPhone? Yeah, it does. You know it. Look at it. And there was a higher life expectancy than other regions because of the cooler climate. Viruses and bacteria were not able to thrive as much as they were the further south. Okay, the middle colonies were made up of New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. The economy was based on cereal crops for export. We talked about cereal crops in the last video, but again, that's grains, wheat, etc. That's why this area is known as the breadbasket colonies. And there's also shipbuilding because there's lots of forest, lots of lumber available to build ships and then trade with New England. William Penn was the founder of Pennsylvania. He had something known as the Holy Experiment. He was a Quaker, and Quakers were people who were pacifists, meaning they didn't fight and they refused to take oaths. So the Holy Experiment is religious toleration in Pennsylvania. William Penn envisioned a very diverse area with lots of religious toleration, not unlike Rhode Island, except that Pennsylvania is much larger. And like Rhode Island, they paid natives for any land that they acquired. Demographics is the most diverse of all regions. We talked in the last video, the English colonies accepted immigrants from other regions of Europe, and they're really going to settle in the middle colony. Scots-Irish, for example, different German provinces, and the Netherlands, you'll see people coming from those regions. There is religious toleration, freedom of religion, especially in Pennsylvania, and there's a large amount of indentured servants and slaves. Slaves working on farms and port cities like New York City, indentured servants doing the same. Okay, we're going to the southern Atlantic coast, that's South Carolina, Georgia, and then the West Indies in the Caribbean. Very important to know this area as well. The economy was based on exporting staple crops to Europe. And when we're talking about staple crops, we mean things like tobacco, sugar, and rice. And here is a sugar plant. There were enormous plantations in this area, and most slaves went to Brazil or the West Indies. And they did so on these incredibly tightly packed ships, where some slaves would have 18 inches between them and the next person when they're cramped onto the ship sleeping. So this was known as the Middle Passage. It was about a 3 to 5 week forced journey from Africa to the Americas. It's part of the triangular trade. And this is just one of the absolute horrors of slavery. And roughly 20% of Africans died on this forced journey from Africa to the Americas. So the demographics of this region, in many cases, African slaves made up most of the population, and this will lead to really harsh slave codes or slave laws that regulate the behavior of slaves. Slaves are going to seek to preserve their autonomy through things like culture. They will have their own language. Gullah is an example of this that developed in South Carolina and Georgia. They would build African-style houses. And religion as well. Many Africans practice a form of animism, but they would also adopt Protestant and Catholic practices to their religions. So jumping over to English colonial governments, for their time, they're very democratic. In New England, you had town hall meetings in which voting was limited to land-owning white male church members, so a very small percentage of the population, but this was a form of democracy. And these voters in turn elected colonial legislatures who would then pass the laws. In southern colonies, politics were dominated by elite planters, especially in the Chesapeake. The governor and many governors were often appointed by England, so there was some control from England, but there was also some government control from the colonies. The Virginia House of Burgesses was established in 1619, located near Jamestown, Virginia. You can go to this building as well. And this was the first representative government in the colonies in which people would elect government officials to vote on their behalf. And voting requirements did change a little bit over time, but what was consistent for voting requirements was mostly land-owning white men. Sometimes there was a church requirement, other times there was not. All right, let's do a quick recap. In the Chesapeake, first of all, know that it is Maryland and Virginia. The original labor source was indentured servants. There was a switch to African slavery after Bacon's Rebellion. In New England, religion impacted the region. Think of Rhode Island, think of Massachusetts. Economy was mixed. Middle colonies, we have some shipbuilding, but a lot of cereal crops. There is freedom of religion in Pennsylvania, and it is the most diverse region with different areas of Europe settling there. Southern colonies focused on things like tobacco, rice, and sugar. Slaves outnumbered whites in many areas, which led to harsh slave codes. Slaves preserved their autonomy in various ways, and the types of governments in New England and Southern colonies. Definitely know that could be great information for a compare and contrast essay or short answer question on the New England and Southern colonies. All right, guys, look forward to seeing you back here for video number 7, the Atlantic economy and European interactions with natives. As always, thank you for watching. Best of luck and have a good day.